Good morning, Shavua Tov. This week is the Parsha of Vayeshev. In this week's Parsha, we read about the story of Yosef, where it's one of the most dramatic stories we read about every year, how Yosef is the favorite child of Yaakov, and at the young age of 17, the siblings already pick up on this favoritism from their father. He presents Yosef with this beautiful wool coat, the Ksonas Pasim, and that further inflames their jealousy, their feelings that Yaakov, he has this special friendship, special kindred spirit. He sees himself in Yosef, and that envy, that jealousy comes to a head where one day the brothers, they travel toward Shechem, and Yaakov tells Yosef that you should go after them. And this is in the aftermath of Yosef telling the brothers about these dreams he's having. There's sheaves out of the field. Yosef's sheaf is the middle, and they're all bowing down to him. Then there's the second dream of the sun and the moon. The moon and the stars are bowing down to Yosef, and the brothers can't take it anymore. They feel that Yosef is trying to totally take over, and they go out to Shechem, and Yaakov tells Yosef to seek out the welfare of his brothers, try to put an end to it. And of course, when he arrives to Shechem, he is informed that the brothers have gone to Dosan. He goes to Dosan, and when they see him, they are plotting to kill him. And ultimately, they throw him into the pit, and they decide they'd rather sell him. He's sold off to these Arab merchants, and from there, he is handed off there's the Ishmaelim, there's the Midianites, and ultimately he ends up in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, where he is a slave to Potiphar, who is the chief butcher of Paro. And the story for Yosef keeps on getting worse. The wife of Potiphar is trying to ensnare him in a trap of immorality, and Yosef resists her advances, and he is then accused of these trumped up charges, and he is sent to jail for 12 years. So this is broadly the story of Vayeshev, and we know that the Shalah, Rabbi Yeshaya Halevi Horowitz, in his work known as the Shalah Shnei Luchot Habris, he writes that every single holiday on the Jewish calendar is associated, is connected with the Parsha of that week. And therefore, we know that today is the 20th of Kislev. It is the second day of the 2-day Yom Tov of Yotes, the 19th and the 20th of Kislev, which celebrates the liberation, the exoneration of the Alter Rebbe, which we spoke about last week. And the Rebbe would say that there must be a link between this week's Parsha, the whole theme, and the events that transpired in 1798 with the liberation of the Alter Rebbe. And even though in a year like this, where the day of Yud Tes Kislev was yesterday, was on the Parsha of Vayishlach, nevertheless, the Rebbe says that by Mincha time we read in the Torah from the Parsha of Vayeshev, which was around that time on Yud Tes Kislev in the afternoon, when he was notified about his that he would be released. And further, the day of Chav Kislev, which is today, was the day he was actually released. So therefore, there is certainly a connection between the Parsha of Vayeshev and the whole story of Yud Tes Kislev. Now you may say, well, on the face of it, you could see that connection, because the story of Vayeshev, as we mentioned, there's a sibling rivalry, which culminates in the end that Yosef ends up in jail. And in a similar way, by the Alter Rebbe, there was this feud, there was great opposition to the teachings of Chassidus, which really led to a very bitter argument and divisiveness in the Jewish community at the time, which also culminated in the arrest of the Alter Rebbe. So there is some superficial connection in that regard. However, if we look at the very theme of the Parsha of Vayeshev, it's not about the liberation of Yosef. In fact, the whole story is about the events which led not just to Yosef's personal incarceration, but in fact, it led to the exile of the entire Jewish nation. The Midrash tells us, gives an example, a parable of a cow that was being led to the slaughterhouse. And it resisted. It did not want to go. Perhaps it sensed intuitively that this was not somewhere it would want to go. So what they did was they took its calf, and they led in front of this cow. They led the calf, and as the mother instinct, it follows its calf towards where it's going, even though it's not something that going in that direction is not for. It's not in its best interests, but to follow and look after its own calf, it follows along. In a similar way, it says that Yaakov, it was already foretold that he would have to go down to Mitzrayim. It was already designed, orchestrated in the Bris Ben Absarim, in the covenant and the parts, that ultimately the Jewish people would go down to Egypt and they would be enslaved there. It was already spoken about many, many years earlier. And the truth is, if it was a galus, Yaakov would have been brought down in chains and in handcuffs to be brought down as a prisoner. But Hashem said, it's unbecoming. He is my B'ni B'chari Yisrael, my beloved, my firstborn Jewish child. It's not befitting, it's unbecoming to be led down this way. So Yosef was initially sent down, and through the slavery and whatnot, and therefore as sold as a slave, and then subsequently we read about in next week's parsha, in two parshas, in the parsha Vayigash, how Yaakov ultimately joins along. So the whole theme of this parsha is actually sets the stage for the Gullus, for the time that the Jewish people would ultimately end in Mitzrayim. So this is where the things really are put in motion. When Yosef is this whole feud with his brothers, which ends up in his being sold as a slave in Egypt, actually precipitates all the events of that would transpire in the future years, the Gullus of Mitzrayim. Now, we know that the fact that in the end the Jews did go down to Mitzrayim wasn't really a punishment. It was in the covenant of parts, in the Bris Ben Absarim, Hashem told Avram that indeed they will be enslaved, but in the end, they will emerge from their slavery with fabulous wealth. And this is not just physical wealth. The whole purpose of going to Mitzrayim was because there was a spiritual purpose. There was a mission and a mandate to elevate and to extract the spiritual energies and sparks that were there. And that was a whole process whereby they would elevate Mitzrayim and prepare themselves for the receiving of the Torah. As Hashem said, that the whole purpose of their liberation was to receive the Torah. So there was a spiritual, and in a sense, you could say there was a purpose, there was a meaning to Mitzrayim. And it wasn't just they went down as a punishment, because logically it doesn't appear that they were deserving of any punishment. It was just a mission. They were just sent there for a certain purpose, and when that was fulfilled, they ultimately were released and liberated. And this is true not just in the grand scheme of things, but even in Yosef's personal life. He was sold as a slave. But we read about in the parsha of Miketz and Vayigash and Vayechi how, on a practical level, the selling of Yosef to Mitzrayim had great benefit, because he was the one who was able to decipher the dreams of the butler and the baker at the end of this week's parsha, and that put him in prime position to interpret the dreams of Paro in next week's parsha, which really held the key to the survival and the ability to preserve food during the years of plenty to sustain not just Egypt but the entire world in the days of and years of famine and hunger. So as Yosef tells his brother, you think you sold me as a slave, L'michya shlachani aleichem. Ultimately, I was sent here for a very, very special purpose and mission, because through this I was able to provide sustenance to the entire world, to save them from a horrible death through famine. So in the end, Yosef was quite successful in that regard. So you could see that all of the events that transpires in this parsha actually serve a higher and important purpose. So perhaps we could link that idea to the Alter Rebbe as well, that he did indeed go through a difficult time in his arrest and his incarceration. And the parallel you could say is that at the end of the day, and we touched on this in last week's talk, that when the Alter Rebbe went to jail, it was a difficult process. He was subject to interrogation and to all kinds of inconveniences and disrespect from the guards. But ultimately, when they came around to appreciate who he was accorded a respect and an honor. And in fact, through that process, he was able to receive the sanctioning and the permission from the government to continue teaching these ideas of Chassidus. And the Rebbe Rashab said that we could view the whole saga of Yutes Kislev, his arrest and his liberation, as one would look at an olive, where the olive is filled with the oil. But until you crush it and you extract the oil, it's something that is not visible. We are not able to enjoy it. It is only through crushing the olive that the oil emerges. And in a similar way, the Alter Rebbe, through going through that harrowing process of his arrest and going through the jail, it is then the teachings of Chassidus began to be disseminated and to be proliferated at a greater and much deeper and elaborate and detailed manner than it was before. So there was a certain benefit where there was the teachings of Chassidus really spread and were reached communities and people that it wasn't able to reach before. Yet the bottom line is, in the parsha, we need to have a good grasp and appreciation what the parsha of Vayeshev is really trying to tell us, because at face value, yes, you could say that Yosef, he went through a difficult life, he went through a difficult process, but ultimately it led to a very positive outcome. And that is indeed the case. But we don't see that in this week's parsha. We don't see anything positive. We see Yosef being pained and mistreated by his brothers. We see him being sold into slavery, having his difficult encounters, whether it's with Potiphar's wife and in jail. All the good stories, the feel-good ending, this rags to riches story doesn't take place only till next week in Mekates and in Vayigash. We don't see it in this week's parsha. So at face value, we can't say that this parsha of Vayeshev directly links to this story of liberation, Geula, like the Alter Rebbe experienced on Yutes Kislev. So we need to dig a little deeper and be able to appreciate the story of Yosef. Being a prisoner, we need to see it through a different lens. And the Medrash says a very fascinating thing. When the Torah describes Yosef's descent, going down to Mitzrayim, it says, V'Yosef hurad Mitzrayim. Yosef was brought down to Mitzrayim from Israel down to Egypt. He was brought by these caravans from the Ishmaelim. He was handed to the Midyanim, to Potiphar. Now, the word hurad means like Yerida. He descended, he went down. The Medrash has an interesting twist. The word hurad could also link to the word v'yerd, which there's a verse in Tehillim, v'yerd miyam ad yam, which means it's according to many Mefarshim, it's referring to Mashiach, that he will rule. V'yerd, he will rule like Roda, uredu b'dgas hayam, like we have the verse in Bereshis, to be Roda, to rule, to have dominion over this from miyam ad yam, from sea to sea. As Canadians, we all know that this is something I studied for my citizenship test recently, that initially Canada was called the Dominion of Canada because one of the initial participants in the Confederacy, he was inspired by a verse in Psalms which says V'yerd miyam ad yam, and that was the motto of Canada, the dominion from coast to coast, from sea to sea. And this is the pasuk in Tehillim is saying that Mashiach, we find a similar verse by King Shlomo Melech, by King Solomon as well, the Yerd miyam ad yam, he will rule from sea to sea. So the Midrash is linking the word V'yerd to the word Hurad, which Hurad means he descended, he went down. And on the surface, the Midrash seems to be implying that since Yosef ultimately became the viceroy, the Mishnah Melech, the second in command in Mitzrayim, so Yosef, Hurad, he went down to Mitzrayim, but ultimately Kavshon, he conquered, he vanquished all of the challenges, and V'yerd, and ultimately he catapulted to the second highest position in the Egyptian Empire. The Yerd miyam ad yam, now he ruled the entire world. Even though it was just Egypt, but since it was the superpower, Yosef had such an incredible position where he ruled essentially the entire world. Now, based on this interpretation, the Midrash is merely saying that Yosef, after he went down to Mitzrayim, ultimately V'yerd, it led to a time where he was ruling the miyam ad yam, from sea to sea. However, if we take the Medrash at face value, it's actually saying something deeper than that, because it's interpreting the word V'yerd. The word Hurad, it's interpreting as V'yerd. In other words, the descent, when Yosef is going down to Mitzrayim, it is then that he is ruling, which is hard to understand, because when Yosef was brought down to Mitzrayim, he was a victim. He was sold as a slave beyond his control. He was in a circumstance, he was in an environment where you have Potiphar, he was, and subsequently he's in jail. During that whole process, it's hard to say that he was in control. He was ruling his environment, not just never mind from sea to sea. Even on a day-to-day schedule, a slave has no free choice. It doesn't determine when they could eat, when they could sleep, where that freedom of movement, any of that. So how could we say that Yosef was v'yerd miyam ad yam, when he is sold and sent down to Mitzrayim? At that point we say v'yerd, now he is a ruler. Now he has dominion over sea to sea. And there's another twist on that. The Hurad could also mean not just Hurad, he was brought down, but the Medrash sees in that a deeper meaning of Horid, which means he brought down. Who did he bring down? Horid et HaShchina. Along with him, he brings the Shechina into Galus. So somehow, in this environment, Yosef, Hurad Mitzrayim, he is sold forcibly. And in fact, the Midrash says that when Yosef was brought down to Mitzrayim, he passes by his mother's caver and he's crying and he's saying, Hashem, what are they doing to me? I don't want any of this. And yet during that whole experience, we say that he is ruling and he is drawing down, he's bringing along with him the Shechina to Mitzrayim. So one of the ways, the way the Rebbe explains this phenomenon is that in any time someone encounters a situation where they are facing great challenge, great darkness, great difficulty, Many people have different responses. There's different ways we could react to these challenges. Some, they surrender, they give up. It's too difficult to deal with the pain or the challenge that they're dealing with in life, and it could be whether it's financial, it could be health, or whatever situation every person's dealing with in their relationship. And when they hit that road bump, right away they surrender, they throw in the towel. Or they could just ignore it. It's just easier to live in an alternate reality, to be oblivious to the situation, because it's very, very hard to deal with the reality that you can't overcome, or you can't see your success in it. So you pretend that it doesn't exist. So the commonality between all of that is that you don't engage with the problem. You ignore the problem. You hope it'll go away. You pretend it doesn't exist. Or you quite simply say, I'm not dealing with it. It's too much for me. And you throw in the towel. Or you could deal with it. You could fight with that challenge, or you could somehow deal with that challenge to the extent that you overcome it. Those are the two general possibilities. Either you engage or you disengage. That's essentially what it comes down to in life. And generally speaking, when we look at our role models, whether it was the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the Shvatim, in general, we see that until Yosef came around, generally speaking, they had the tactic of disengagement. We don't find that any of the Shvatim or Yaakov, primarily they were shepherds. They were people who lived a lifestyle which was more of a disengagement, hermetic. They didn't really have a job which necessitated to deal with all of the complications and the nuances of life. When you're a shepherd, you could pretty much live a life of seclusion. You could live a self-sustained lifestyle without needing to be burdened or bogged down by the prevailing milieu that you're living in. Yosef was the first example of someone who actually lived a life where he was very, very involved. Talking about engaging the world, he was someone that had some of the most greatest responsibilities, and in a society which was totally different, not just totally different, but the diametric opposite of his upbringing, with studying with his father every day, studying Torah, in that beautiful cocoon that he had growing up in Eretz Yisrael. Now here he's in Mitzrayim. Erevas Haaretz is the land of immorality. And in such an environment, not just to maintain his spiritual values and ideals, but to also, not just to keep up with it, but he had a lot of responsibilities. Ultimately, he, whether it was in the house of Potiphar, he's given tremendous responsibilities. He runs his whole household. He had complete trust in him. And further, when Yosef is in the prison, in the Beis HaSohar, he runs the entire prison. All the matters, all the affairs are run through Yosef. He had a grace about him. The masters, they right away, they see there's a certain chen, there's a certain charm, there's a certain grace about him, and they had complete trust and confidence in Yosef. So here's Yosef running the household of Potiphar, who was a very, very prominent member in the Paro palace and court. And further, when he's in jail as well, he has the keys. He's running everything over there, even though he's a prisoner himself. And this is certainly the case when Yosef emerges from prison after 12 years. He now becomes the greatest person in Mitzrayim, second to Paro. He is the viceroy. He is the minister of finance of the economy. He's running the entire show over there. All of the decisions about all the food and the rationing and who gets what is all run through Yosef. So this is a model, a lifestyle which we don't find by any other of his predecessors till that point. As much as Yaakov was in Haran, and he lived for 20 years under Lavan, as deceitful and sly and conniving as he was, Yaakov wasn't a slave, right? He wasn't. He had a certain autonomy, independence. He was able to raise his family there. yes, he was working there, but even his the nature of his work was looking after the flock. He didn't have all the burdens and all of the challenges that Yosef had to when running an empire like Egypt. So Yosef clearly has a whole new approach, a whole new attitude to his life. And one wonders how Yosef was able to maintain all of that. And in fact, one would actually expect a whole different attitude from Yosef. He would be the last person you would think that would have such a cavalier attitude to all that life has thrown him. As we mentioned, he suffered much in his life. As a young boy at 8 years old, he's orphaned. He loses his mother. At 17, he is sold by his brothers, his very family, betrayed, stabbed in the back, sold as a slave, which in those days, when you're sold as a slave, you basically have no prospects in life. You're never going to be able to. Once you are a slave for life. You never really graduated. You were property of your master, and when they were done with you, they sold you off to another person. So Yosef, he finally, as he's sold as a slave to Potiphar, he's able to carve out some semblance of achievement, of normalcy. He's put in charge to run the house of Potiphar. But finally, when things get a little bit stable and a little bit convenient for him, he has the wife of Potiphar who, through her seductions and her advances, he gets thrown into jail on these charges of him trying to be intimate with the wife of Potiphar, which is a grievous sin, and he's thrown into jail. So here he's 18 years old. From 18 to 30, for 12 years, in the most prime years of his life, he's rotting away, not just in a jail, in a pit. And here, you would think you throw in the towel. This is the end of the line. You're young. Your family doesn't know if you're alive. They're probably not thinking about you. Nobody knows who you are. There's nobody familiar. You're in a different land, a different language. And what's the best case scenario? Who knows if you're ever going to get out of jail? And if you can get out of jail, the best case scenario, you'll just be another slave to another master. And it is here in jail that slowly you see that Yosef, the Beis Hasar, the Torah testifies that his master sees that Hashem is with him, and whatever he does, he's successful. This is an incredible thing. He is able to transform his environment. He is able to turn the tables around, where everyone looks at him and say, "Wow, this is a man with purpose. This is a man with ambition, and this is a person who there's a grace, there's a charm about him." And wherever he goes, in every situation, whether it's by Potiphar, whether it's in the jail, and subsequently when he interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker, Yosef is able to turn that circumstance, and he makes the best out of it. How does Yosef do that? It is the most unexpected thing that a person who is in a situation that they're in jail, everything is taken away from them, their freedom, their optimism, their opportunity. But no, Yosef does not let go, and he does not become. And in fact, we see it in the story of the butler and the baker, where he wakes up one morning and he turns to them and he says, "Guys, I noticed that you're sad today. Why are you sad?" And ultimately, it is because he asks them that question. They open up to him. He interprets their dreams, which years later will put him in a position to interpret the dreams of Paro, which unlock the key to the salvation of the entire civilization. So Yosef, in every situation, in every opportunity that he has, he could just easily let go and say, "You know what, forget about it. This is not for me. The whole world turned on me. My family, the closest people, the people who I should rely on, weren't there for me. So, you know what, there's no purpose to all of this." But he does the very opposite. What exactly motivates him? But before we get to that, what does this teach us? It teaches us that Yosef, he was in jail. He was a slave. But this is what the Medrash is alluding to. V'yerd, on the word hurad, where Yosef is descend, already then v'yerd, already there, he is in control of the situation. He is not just a passive victim who is just thrown in the towel. He is actually Vayerd. He is a ruler. There is a dominion. He is in charge of a situation every step of the way. And here is where we could link directly the story of Yosef to the Alter Rebbe. Because the Alter Rebbe himself, he went to jail. But did he really go to jail? Was it his decision? Or was he just going along, just drifting along in the story? Well, we know that if the Alter Rebbe didn't want to go to jail, he wouldn't go to jail. He could have, as it's brought down in the talks of the previous Rebbe, if he wanted, the Alter Rebbe met with some of his contemporaries, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev and Rebbe Baruch of Mezhebush, they said, Rebbe Shneir Zalman, why did you go through such a harrowing and difficult experience to go to jail and you're interrogated and all of that, to deal with all that humiliation and excruciating, anguishing experience? You could have just taken your hand and put it over your forehead and the whole thing would go away. The Rebbe had that kind of power. He had that kind of ability. And the Alter Rebbe said, no, that wasn't the purpose. I needed to go through this process. And how do we know the Alter Rebbe could have just made the whole thing go away? He could have just caused, the whole prison could have gone up in flames. Because we know from stories that transpired in prison that when the Alter Rebbe wanted, he was able to manipulate events to his favor. Most famously when they were traveling, and it was by wagon, and it was on a Friday, reaching Friday afternoon, the Alter Rebbe requested that they stop because he needed to prepare for Shabbos and he couldn't travel on Shabbos. Then they disagreed, and all of a sudden the axle breaks, and so then they bring they try to fix it, and one of the horses collapse, and they bring the 4 horses, and the horses don't budge, and then they realize that there's something extraordinary and paranormal that's transpiring here, and they go to the side of the road and they spend the Shabbos there. So the Alter Rebbe, when he didn't want to go somewhere, he didn't go. So the fact that he actually went to jail was of his own volition. It was his choice. He decided he wanted to go. So that means he was always in charge. Even when he was in a state of prison or in a state of incarceration, it was only because he wanted to be there. And there's a fascinating concept in the Hasidic thought whereby a self-imposed limitation, a self-imposed constraint is not considered a true limitation. You're not truly in a state of jail if you really want to be there. It's like if you have a Houdini, somebody who they put on all these handcuffs and these chains, and they put you a chain on the top of another chain, and you go into the box. But you really have the key, which means either you have the key or you have a way of getting out. So you're not truly locked up, because at any moment you want to come out, you could go out. A person could not really limit themselves. That's the key. In the words of in the Hasidic discourses, that a hagbola ritzonis, a self-imposed limitation, is not a true hagbola. It's not a true limitation. And there's a fascinating halacha that talks about this idea. We know that it is customary for all Jewish males to wear a kippah, a head covering, and especially we have to ensure this when we say. We pronounce a bracha, we say Hashem's name, and let's say a person is in a position, their yarmulke flies off, it defies the Jewish gravity, and they don't have their kippah. So many would just take their hand and put it over their head. So the halacha states that you cannot cover your head with your hand, with your own skin. You need to have a foreign material, or foreign, or some a napkin, a foreign substance. Only that could cover your head. When you take your hand and you cover it over your head like this, without anything interposing between the skin of your hand and the skin of your head is not considered covered. What's the rationale? What's the logic? Because the notion of covering means that there is something extraneous, something outside of you is covering yourself. If you are trying to cover yourself, there is no covering. You, your hand and your head are one. So if you cover your head with your hand, you're not truly covered. So the premise of this halacha is teaching us that just like Houdini, you put on the handcuffs, you wrap yourself up in a chain, and you're in a box. You could say, look at this person. They're incarcerated. They're locked up. They can't move. They're immobile. They're paralyzed. But that's not true, because they have the key. They are able to get out any second they want. So a person cannot limit themselves. So what does this truth, what does this powerful and profound teaching tell us? That just like the Alter Rebbe, every step of the way when he was in jail, there was a door, there was a key. He was always able to get out. Why didn't he get out? We'll talk about it in a second. But the premise is that in any situation he was in charge. He never lost his edge. He never lost that dominion, the vayerd that we spoke about. He has not lost his complete control of the situation. But the Alter Rebbe decided that he needed to go into jail in order to achieve a very specific purpose. Now, this was true not merely that the Alter Rebbe was always in control, but he had a profound impact. Just like we spoke about Yosef, that Potiphar, the jail, the one who was in charge of the jail, were very impressed. They saw Hashem is with him wherever he goes. The Kiddush Hashem that Yosef made wherever he went, there was that parallel in the story of the Alter Rebbe as well. It's known that when they started to appreciate the uniqueness and the greatness of the Alter Rebbe, the word made its way up the chain, all the way up to the Tsar, who said, this Alter Rebbe, he is something very incredible. And the Tsar wanted to see for himself he wanted to see and witness the greatness of the Alter Rebbe. So he dressed up in plain clothes, and he went to visit the Alter Rebbe. And when he entered, right away, even though he was dressed up like one of the interrogators, the Alter Rebbe all of a sudden had a whole different deference, and he greeted this guard with a title of welcoming his highness, his majesty. And the guard said, what you're doing right now is treason. You're addressing me as if I am the Tsar. And the Alter Rebbe says, I sense there is something very special, very unique about you. Because the Talmud says that the Malchusa Da'ara, that the kingship, monarchy, the way it is reflected here in this world, it parallels the kingship and royalty the way it is in the spiritual worlds. Just as we are in Hashem's presence, we sense royalty, so too, in your presence, there is something special here. And therefore, you could wear all the clothes you want, it's not going to fool me. And this impressed, in this case, not just the officers, the interrogators, but the Tsar himself. So there was a Kiddush Hashem that while the Alter Rebbe was in jail, all of the guards and all of the ministers, all the way up to the top, came to appreciate that there was something unique about him. To the extent that when he was liberated, there was explicit permission, government-sanctioned permission to continue his activities, to continue to teach the teachings of Chassidus and its values, to inculcate his students and his disciples and his followers for many, many years. This parallels the story of Yosef. So what really was that drive, that motivation? How did Yosef maintain that positivity, that serenity when he was in jail? And as well, the Alter Rebbe, why did he have to go through that process? So briefly, one of the ideas the Rebbe explains is based on some of the foundational teachings of the Alter Rebbe. One of the ideas we know, as the Alter Rebbe explains in his Tanya, is what we call the doctrine of perpetual creation, which means, as the translation of the Hebrew words, hishavut b'chol rega, this idea that creation wasn't a one-time phenomenon, rather it's an ongoing process, something that Hashem continually renews and recreates this world anew every single moment. So one of the ideas here is that every force, every phenomenon, everything in this world has a divine life force in it. So on a basic level, what we're saying here is that every opportunity, every experience that we have is totally animated, energized, and its very existence is Hashem. There is nothing that we could experience in life that is outside of Hashem. And therefore, Yosef, the Alter Rebbe, wherever they went, they knew that this experience, there has to be a meaning here. There is nothing that is outside of Hashem. There is nothing that exists, was created once, and now it has this autonomy, it has its independence. Everything exists because of Hashem. So there's a hashgacha pratis, there is a divine providence, there's a divine meaning. There's a divine purpose in every single experience that we have. So Yosef knew, if I'm being sent down to Mitzrayim, it seems that I'm being sent down here as a victim. Yosef says, no. L'michya shlachani, Hashem is actually sending me here. There's a very, very deep purpose here. I need to look at everything that I encounter and figure out how to expose, to excavate the divine spark. If I'm being sent into jail, if I'm being sent as a slave, I will take that experience and reveal how that itself is a vehicle, is a place where Hashem exists. One of the other teachings the Alter Rebbe spoke about was this idea that when Hashem created the world, there was one of the great Kabbalistic ideas known as tzimtzum, which means the contracting, the diminishing of Hashem's presence, which deserves a whole talk in itself and many talks. But one of the key ideas here, there was a debate when Hashem had to diminish himself, because in the words of the Kabbalah, the whole world was filled with the infinite energy and light of Hashem. So that did not give space, that did not lend itself the opportunity for a finite physical world to be created. So there had to be somehow a reduction in Hashem's presence to give space. We're talking about conceptual space for the world to exist. Did Hashem really reduce himself? Did he really make himself smaller? Which in the Kabbalistic parlance is tzimtzum kipshuto or tzimtzum lo eno kipshuto. Do we say that the tzimtzum quite literally actually happened, or it did not really happen? And the question is there a place where Hashem is not there? Some said that in a place of idol worship, in a place of immorality, like a king who is in his ivory tower in his palace and he observes a filthy, dirty place. The king doesn't go there. He may preside over it. He may supervise over it. There's a providence, but he's not actually there. So many said that Hashem, he knows about everything that's going on in the world, but there's certain places he simply should not be and will not be. The Alter Rebbe taught this idea that, of course, it's impossible to say that. Hashem is everywhere. He must be. There is nothing that exists outside of Hashem. And in a brief meditation, this teaches us that wherever we go in life, we see something that seems to be antithetical, seems to be against Hashem. We have a certain mission in life. We have a life, we have a family, we have a career, and then we run up against something and it seems too difficult to overcome. If we say that tzimtzum eino kipshuto, if we say that there is no space that is devoid of the presence of Hashem, it is impossible that there is a force or a phenomenon in this world that could truly interfere, that could truly undermine our mission in life. So some people, they would be in Yosef's shoes and they would say, okay, I'm a slave right now. Right now I'm a victim. Eventually, I believe in Hashem and I believe that in Hashgacha Pratis. Eventually, at some point, I think that the Geula will come. And when that happens, I will be right. I have my bitachon that when that time comes, I'll be able to do what I need to do. But that's not what we're saying here. We're saying here is that if Hashem creates the world every second, and He is everywhere, that means even when you are the slave, even when you're still in that situation where you think you are out of control, no, you actually are still in control if you choose to be. if you choose to believe that Hashem is there with you, so then you look at that situation and then you say, you know what? Hashem is really here. There's actually something very positive happening here. So if we deliberately choose to view our situation as one where we are sent on a specific mission to accomplish something very specific, to reveal the good and the truth of that situation, so then we are like Yosef. We're hurad. We are being schlepped down. That's what appears on the opposite. But what's really happening? V'yerd. You're ruling from sea to sea. And this is where he horid hashchina. The other interpretation, he brought the Shechina down with him. He may have appeared to be schlepped by these Yishmaelites, but really Yosef had his own program. He was living in a reality where he was in total control of the situation. And therefore, Yosef, the Alter Rebbe, the teaching of Chassidus empower each and every one of us that no matter what we are dealing with in life, as we have mentioned before, the interview that Rebbe had with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Olav Asylum, where when he asks, the Rebbe asks him, what are you doing for Jewish life on campus in Cambridge University? And what does he says? Well, Rebbe, in the situation that I find myself, and the Rebbe cuts him off and says, no, my father-in-law, the Rebbe Rayat, said, a Jew never finds himself in a situation. You put yourself in a situation. And if you could put yourself in one situation, you could put yourself in another situation. If we feel trapped, if we feel helpless, yes, we all daven to Hashem, we should have no challenges, we should have no nisyonos. And it appears some go through certain challenges that are unimaginable. But we have to remember that wherever we go, we put ourselves in our circumstance. So let us put ourselves in a positive circumstance. And in the merit of the Chag Geula of the Alter Rebbe, which it's the Chag of Geula, redemption, that will bring salvation to each and every one of us, those who need a individual, unique Geula, as well as the Geula, the redemption, the salvation for all of Klal Yisrael. May it be that in this month of Kislev, as we approach the Yom Tov of Chanukah, which there were many, many niflois, wondrous miracles. We should all experience Geula, redemption in our lives. We should witness miracles with the coming of Mashiach.